At first, they felt like a dream. They said all the right things. They smiled in all the right places. They leaned in when you spoke like they were listening to your soul. The connection felt effortless, as if the universe had orchestrated your meeting to finally soothe the ache that had been living inside you for years. They seemed safe, gentle, present. And for the first time in a long time, you allowed yourself to exhale. You told yourself, this is different. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The messages took longer. The attention wavered. The warmth that once radiated from them cooled into distance. They didn't laugh at your jokes anymore. They didn't ask you how you were. They became short, distant, ambiguous, and somewhere inside you began to panic. What changed? What did I do wrong? Why are they pulling away? You started replaying old conversations, looking for the moment you lost them. You rewrote texts before sending them. You asked your friends for advice, read between lines that didn't exist, and shrank a little more each time they didn't show up like they used to. But here's the truth Carl Jung would want you to understand. They didn't change. They just stopped performing. They stopped managing the version of themselves they wanted you to see, and started relaxing into the version of themselves they always were. And what you're mourning now is not just them, it's the mask they wore. You're grieving the illusion. Jung wrote extensively about the concept of the persona, the social mask each of us wears to survive in the world. It's the version of us we present to gain acceptance, approval, or admiration. And in the beginning of a relationship, the persona is usually front and center. We show up as who we think the other person wants us to be. We're kind, engaged, thoughtful, not because we're being fake, but because we're still managing how we're perceived. We're still curating. But personas are fragile. They require energy to maintain, and eventually they slip. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And when the mask starts to fall, we're left with something far more raw, far more honest, the shadow. This is the moment where their truth begins to show, not the filtered version, not the curated one, but the unconscious patterns that run deeper than charm or charisma, their real needs, their real wounds, their real limitations. And often it looks like distance, like unpredictability, like defensiveness, like control, like silence when you need reassurance the most. They didn't change, you just met the parts of them they don't show on a first date. And the pain you're feeling now is not because they became someone else. It's because you did what we all do. You filled in the gaps with your hopes. You projected your ideal. You saw not just who they were, but who you wanted them to be. This is what Jung called projection, the unconscious transfer of our own desires, wounds, and expectations onto another person. We don't just fall in love with people. We fall in love with the meaning we place on them, the story they help us tell ourselves. So when they smiled at you and leaned in close, you didn't just see a person. You saw safety, belonging, wholeness, maybe even redemption. And that narrative became so powerful, so emotionally charged, that when their real self began to emerge, when their behavior no longer matched your projection, it felt like betrayal. But they didn't betray you, they revealed themselves. And the gap between your projection and their truth is what's breaking your heart. It's hard to accept that people aren't who we hoped they'd be. It's even harder to accept that maybe, on some level, we already knew. That the red flags were there, subtle but present. That the little pangs of doubt we brushed off weren't just anxiety but intuition. But we didn't want to see it, because seeing it would mean giving up the dream. And when you've spent your whole life searching for something real, the last thing you want is to be told it was never real to begin with. So we hold on, we excuse, we justify, we shrink ourselves to keep the illusion alive. We tolerate the mixed signals, the coldness, the emotional neglect, because the fantasy was too beautiful to surrender. But eventually truth demands to be seen. And when it is, it doesn't come gently, it comes like a storm. The truth is this: people don't change overnight. What changes is your understanding of who they are. What shifts is your ability to see through the mask. And that clarity, while painful, is a gift, because it calls you back to yourself. It asks you to examine your own projections, your own hopes, your own patterns. It shows you where you gave too much, where you ignored the tension in your gut, where you prioritized being chosen over being honest with yourself. It shows you what still needs healing. And that's where Jung would have you look, not at them, but at you. Because the shadow is not just something we see in others. It lives within us. In the parts of ourselves we deny, repress, or disown. And when someone mirrors those parts, when their behavior pokes at our wounds, we call it chemistry, we call it fate, we call it love, but often what we're really experiencing is recognition. You recognized in them something that spoke to your history, a familiar pattern, a similar wound, and you tried, unconsciously, to heal your past by changing the ending this time, by loving them so purely, so deeply, that they'd have no choice but to finally choose you, finally stay, finally give you what the others couldn't. But love isn't healing when it's based on fantasy. It's just repetition. A reenactment of the same emotional script with a different cast. And now you're here again, heartbroken, confused, grieving not just the person, but the hope they carried, the version of yourself you got to be when they were still playing the part. But this is where the work begins, not in trying to get them back, not in trying to convince yourself they'll return, not in decoding their behavior or rewriting the past. The work begins in accepting what was real and what was not. They didn't change, they just stopped hiding. They showed you their patterns, their wounds, their limits, and now you get to choose. Will you love them as they are, or will you finally love yourself enough to walk away from a story that doesn't honor your truth? Because love without clarity isn't love, it's longing. And longing, unchecked, becomes self-abandonment. Jung believed that wholeness comes not from perfection, but from integration. From seeing the whole picture, not just the light, but the shadow, not just the charm, but the dysfunction, not just the potential, but the reality. And that includes the parts of you that were willing to settle for less, the part that clung to crumbs, the part that confused unpredictability with passion, the part that saw red flags and painted them white because it was easier than being alone. Those parts need your compassion, not your judgment, because they were doing what they were trained to do, survive. But survival is not the same as love. And now that you see clearly, you don't have to repeat the cycle. You don't have to rewrite yourself to fit someone else's capacity. You get to choose peace over potential, presence over performance, reality over the illusion. And in that choice, the decision to no longer chase the illusion, to no longer betray yourself for the fantasy, something deeply sacred begins to happen. It doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, like light entering a room that has been dark for years. It begins the moment you stop blaming yourself for someone else's limitations. When you finally understand that their inability to love you the way you needed has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their own unresolved wounds. You stop blaming yourself for the withdrawal you felt. You stop carrying the weight of their silence like it's evidence of your failure. You stop believing that if only you were better, more quiet, more fun, more perfect, they would have stayed. Because now you realize you are not the problem. You are simply the mirror. And mirrors don't lie, they reveal. You stop chasing closure from someone who never gave you clarity when it mattered, someone who left you with questions, not answers, confusion, not peace. And you start to understand that the closure you were searching for is not out there, in their explanations or apologies. It's inside in your ability to stop abandoning yourself to be loved by someone who never really saw you. You stop trying to decode their mixed signals, their cold responses, their emotional unavailability, because you now see that the only person worth decoding is yourself. And then comes the deeper shift. You stop trying to make sense of behavior that never aligned with your needs in the first place. That confusion you kept calling love, that hot and cold dynamic that kept your nervous system on edge, was never safety. It was never home. But because your emotional blueprint was shaped in chaos, it felt like home. That's what Carl Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." You kept calling it fate, but now you're calling it what it really was, a pattern. And once you see it clearly, you stop believing that the loss of them is the loss of love itself. You realize that what you lost wasn't love. It was the performance, the projection, the temporary illusion that someone else could complete what was always missing inside of you. And the illusion was powerful, yes, but it wasn't real. Because now you understand what you lost was not your soulmate, it was the mask they wore. The curated version of themselves they gave you at the beginning, the one designed to gain your trust, your affection, your belief that this time would be different. And as the mask slipped, as the inconsistencies appeared, as the truth began to unravel, you were not watching them change. You were watching the veil lift. And what you found underneath, beneath the heartbreak, beneath the longing, beneath the spiral of self-doubt, was something priceless. The truth of who they are, unfiltered, unhidden, and unable to meet you where you are. The truth of what you actually need, not just to be loved, but to be loved well, consistently, securely, fully. And perhaps most importantly, the truth of who you are becoming. The self that emerges when you stop shrinking, stop performing, stop betraying yourself in the name of being chosen. That self is not weak. That self is powerful, radiant, whole. That self was never broken, just buried under layers of conditioning and unmet needs. They didn't change. They simply stopped performing. And now that you see them clearly, now that the fog has lifted, the question is not how do I win them back? It's not how do I become better so they'll choose me again? Number the real question, the one Jung would want you to ask, is how do I get myself back? The version of you who trusted your intuition before you were gaslit out of it. The version of you who believed that love should feel like safety, not a test. The version of you who stopped accepting emotional crumbs when you were made for a feast. This is what Jung called individuation, the psychological process of integrating all parts of the self, both light and shadow, into a whole and conscious being. It is not a path for the faint-hearted. It requires courage to confront your projections, humility to face your inner wounds, and strength to stop repeating old patterns. Jung believed that we do not truly see others until we first see ourselves, and most of us enter relationships not from clarity, but from compulsion, from an unconscious desire to reenact familiar pain in hopes of achieving a new outcome. That's why heartbreak doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes you. It feels like your world is collapsing, not because they were your whole world, but because the illusion they represented was holding up your sense of self. But that collapse is not destruction, it's initiation, the beginning of seeing clearly, the beginning of becoming whole. Because the realest thing you will ever do is stop romanticizing someone's potential and start honoring your own truth. You stop saying, but they could be different if, and start saying, even if they changed, would it ever be enough for the person I'm becoming? Because the answer is usually no. You don't need someone to be different. You don't need them to come back more healed, more available, more whole. You just need the courage to see them, not as who you wish they were, but as who they've shown themselves to be. You need the courage to believe yourself the first time they made you feel unworthy, confused, or unseen. You need the courage to stop clinging to the fantasy that your love will fix them. Because love is not about fixing, love is about meeting. And if someone cannot meet you where you are, with honesty and consistency and presence, then it's not your job to bend. It's not your responsibility to carry the weight of the relationship alone. And it is never your purpose to sacrifice your emotional well-being for the sake of someone else's comfort. This is the work. Not romantic, not poetic, but soul-deep. This is the process of reclaiming your power, of recognizing that love rooted in pain is not destiny, it's memory. It's your nervous system remembering what it felt like to earn affection, to walk on eggshells, to survive love instead of being nourished by it. And the moment you become conscious of that truth is the moment you begin to heal. You stop settling for chemistry that burns but doesn't warm. You stop confusing unpredictability for passion. You stop choosing what's familiar over what's healthy. You begin to choose differently, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. And the most radical act of self-respect is this. You see the red flags, and instead of painting them white, you walk away. You stop writing love stories with people who only speak in confusion. You stop chasing the version of them that existed in the beginning, and instead trust the version they revealed in the end, because that was the truth all along. They didn't change, they just showed you who they were. And now it's your turn to show yourself who you are. Not the one who waits. Not the one who pleads. Not the one who hopes they'll wake up and realize what they lost. You are the one who rises. You are the one who chooses yourself, even when it hurts. You are the one who doesn't abandon your truth, even when it means being alone for a little while longer. Because you would rather be whole and healing than half-loved and shrinking. You would rather be rooted in truth than floating in fantasy. You would rather come home to yourself than keep losing yourself for someone who was never home to begin with. And that is how you end the cycle. That is how you break free. That is how you become the one who never needed saving, just remembering.